The maid just wanted to work in peace, but the Bruises made the Millionaire act. The iron gate at the Duarte estate creaked open slowly, the morning sun still drying the dew on the grass. Helena stepped inside quietly, like she didn't want to leave a trace. Clutched to her chest was a small backpack, too light to carry a lifetime, but heavy enough to nearly pull her to the ground. She wore simple clothes, yet perfectly clean. Her hair was twisted into a low bun, her gaze cast downward, shoulders hunched. Everything about her seemed to apologize for merely existing. The house was enormous, elegant, silent. But it wasn't the size that intimidated her. It was being there at all. Alive, breathing, after months of being treated like nothing. It was Mrs. Lucia, the housekeeper, who met her at the door. A woman with a stern expression, calloused hands, and a look that, while not gentle, could recognize when someone carried more than just a past. "You're early," she said simply, no smile but no judgment either. Helena nodded, measured, as if every movement had been rehearsed, not to disturb. Those first hours passed without a hitch, no noise, no questions, no pauses. Helena cleaned as though hiding behind each chore, never meeting anyone's eyes, too efficient for a newbie, too quiet for someone her age. She seemed trained to vanish. Late that morning, Eduardo Duarte, the master of the house, brushed past her. Tall, sharp, always in a hurry. He didn't even notice the new help, phone wedged between shoulder and chin, barking orders, signing contracts. To him, people came and went. Staff existed to keep things running, not to be remembered. But Helena saw him, noticed the tone of his voice, the look of someone living more in the future than the present, and she quickly dropped her gaze, as always. That day there were no shocks, but there was no peace either. Peace, for someone carrying invisible scars, doesn't arrive unannounced. It has to be earned, and Helena was still far from that. At day's end, Mrs. Lucia called her aside. She watched her for a moment, then said, "You did everything right. You're discreet, fast. That's good. But here, you don't have to be afraid." Helena shook her head. She wanted to say thank you, but no sound came. Her throat was too tight. "Any trouble at your last job?" Lucia asked, casting out a line and waiting. "No, ma'am. I just prefer to keep to myself," Helena replied, her firmness practiced, but her eyes told a different story. Mrs. Lucia didn't press. She'd seen other girls like Helena, arriving as if pulled from the rubble. Some never spoke. Others spoke only with their eyes. But they all shared one thing: fear. Fear rooted long before that day. Later in the kitchen at dusk, Helena arranged the cutlery with calm, repetitive motions, her mind wandering, her hands steady. When Eduardo came in to grab a glass of water, she froze for a heartbeat, then kept working as if he weren't there. That's when the sleeve slipped. Quick, a split second. A dark purple bruise by her elbow, one you didn't get from a simple stumble, one left by someone squeezing too hard in anger. Eduardo saw it, said nothing, just stared for far too long, then turned and left as if he hadn't noticed. But he did notice, and Helena felt it, her heart pounding, her skin burning. She sensed that maybe, for the first time in a long time, someone had seen what she'd been through, even without a single word from her. That night, tucked into the small servants' quarters, she didn't sleep, eyes wide, staring at the ceiling, trying to guess what Eduardo would think. Did he buy her lie about banging the doorknob? Would he ask questions? Would he send her away? But he didn't ask. And that silence was almost more frightening than any scream. It was Helena's second day at the Duarte estate. The sky was still dark when she flipped on the pantry light. She started arranging everything in silence, jars lined up, labels facing forward, everything in its place. Her hands moved with almost military precision, but there was no hurry. There was fear. The kind of fear you don't shout about, the kind you carry in hunched shoulders, in light footsteps, in eyes that never meet anyone else's. She didn't want to make a mistake. More than that, She didn't want to be noticed. At breakfast, Eduardo came into the breakfast nook with the newspaper tucked under his arm. He passed by her without a word. Helena simply looked down and kept serving, as if her presence were nothing but a blur. But he noticed. He noticed the way she shrank whenever he got close, how her body jumped at every sound, every touch, and how she never, ever looked him in the eye for more than a second. That afternoon, Helena was on her knees scrubbing the hallway floor when he walked by again. He didn't speak. He just stopped. She didn't even see him coming. Her gaze stayed fixed on the rag, her hair hiding part of her face. But there was something there, a forced calm. Like each second spent on that floor was an effort to seem normal. Eduardo watched her for far too long. Later, as he climbed the stairs, he casually asked Mrs. Lucia in the hall mirror's reflection, "How's the new girl? What's her name again?" "Helena. And how long has she been here?" "She arrived yesterday. She does everything right. Discreet, maybe too much. Discreet, or just plain scared." The housekeeper paused before answering, looking at him through the mirror. "There's more to her story than shyness." Eduardo nodded without another word, but he couldn't shake that conversation all day. That night, back in his own quarters, he stopped by the kitchen. Helena was alone, finishing up the dishes. The silence was so thick it seemed to fill the room. She looked paler than usual, and there was something odd about her movements, as if her body was there, but her mind was somewhere else. He grabbed a glass of water, as always, but before leaving, he looked at her one more time. It wasn't pity he felt, it was unease, and for Eduardo, unease was dangerous because it made him lose control. Later, just before midnight, Helena slipped out the back door, her phone clenched in her hands. She thought no one could see her, but Eduardo, of all people, happened to be walking the ground floor corridor looking for a headache pill. He saw the faint light in the laundry area. He didn't go in, he just listened. Her voice was low, but it cracked. "I've told you I can't talk to you. Please leave me alone. I'm working. Let me work." Silence. Then a short, muffled line. "I just want to disappear." And then, the click of the call ending. She stayed frozen there, phone still pressed to her chest. Her shoulders shook, but she didn't cry. She'd learned long ago to keep it all inside. Eduardo backed away quietly, unseen. And in that moment, he knew for certain. This wasn't an overreaction. It was a real threat. Someone outside was still controlling her every step, and she just wanted to vanish because she saw no other way out. The next morning, Helena looked even more exhausted than usual. She didn't say more than a word or two, didn't even lift her eyes to thank Mrs. Lucia for the coffee waiting on the counter. She moved through the house as if her body were present, but her mind was trapped somewhere nobody could reach. Eduardo noticed. He asked nothing, but he watched everything, and in silence absorbed what others missed, how Helena held her breath when her phone vibrated in her apron pocket, how she cut the call off in a hurry, how her hands trembled for a few seconds after each call before she went back to work. That day, he went to the office unfocused. Neither reports nor meetings held any weight after what he'd heard the night before. That whisper, "I just want to disappear," kept echoing in his mind. Uncomfortable, human. When he got back late afternoon, he called Marcelo, his driver and trusted security, to the office for a private talk. "I need you to find out where the calls to our new employee are coming from, discreetly. She mustn't suspect a thing, and I need it ASAP." Marcelo didn't ask unnecessary questions. He just nodded. He knew that if Eduardo was involved, it was serious. That night, the mansion felt especially silent, as if even the walls were listening. Helena was cleaning the second-floor bathroom when her phone rang again. The screen lit up, but she didn't answer. She just stared. "Unknown number." Tears welled in her eyes, but she swallowed them, as always. The next day, Marcelo returned with what he'd uncovered. It's a man named Rafael Silveira. He has a history of assault. He once had a restraining order for domestic violence. His ex-wife's name doesn't show up anymore. She withdrew the complaint before trial. But the pattern is clear. Eduardo closed his eyes for a moment. Does he have any ties to Helena? Nothing official, no police record. But I found an old photo. 2 years ago, he tagged her profile in a post captioned, "My little girl." Her account's been deleted, but he's left everything else up. And suddenly, everything made sense. Her reaction, her constant fear, her silence, her wish to vanish. Rafael had been part of her life, and now he was the reason she tried so hard to stay invisible. That afternoon, Eduardo came home early, and for the first time he waited for Helena in the breakfast nook. She walked in carrying a tray, surprised to see him there, but giving nothing more than obedient silence. "Good afternoon, ma'am." He didn't answer right away. He looked at her, really looked. "You okay?" She hesitated. Her body froze for a moment. "Yes, sir." But her eyes couldn't hold his gaze, not for a single second. "You sure?" She nodded, but the truth seeped in between her words. "As always." Then he quietly said, "If something's wrong, you can tell me." She stopped, just for an instant, long enough for him to see that she wanted to, but couldn't, because her fear was still bigger than her trust. "Thank you, sir, but I'm fine." And she left. But Eduardo no longer believed that answer. Not after knowing the name she wouldn't say. It was raining that night. Not a downpour, but that steady, fine rain that seems to wash the world outside while everything inside stays dirty. Helena was in the laundry room, folding clothes, when her phone buzzed again. She didn't look right away. She was tired of it all. The fear, the scares, the expectation that something bad was always about to happen. But the call persisted. When she finally picked up the phone, 3 letters flashed on the screen. RV. She trembled. "Rafael, please stop. I've told you. Don't call me anymore. I'm trying to start over." His voice came back, sharp as a knife. "Start over? With that rich little boss of yours? You think I'll let you?" Helena froze. "If I find out where you are, I swear I'll show up. Let's see if that guy keeps looking at you the same way once he knows who you really are." She hung up immediately. Her whole body shook, and the phone nearly slipped from her hands. Then she realized she wasn't alone. Eduardo stood in the doorway of the laundry room, holding a mug of tea. He'd gone looking for medicine, or maybe fate had brought him there. "He called again?" he asked, his voice calm but hiding a storm inside. Helena didn't answer. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she even noticed. "You're scared of him?" She nodded, eyes cast down. Her rigid posture melted into a silent plea for help. Eduardo stepped closer, not touching her but speaking firmly. "This has to stop. He'll go after my mother," she murmured. "He always says that if I disappear, he'll come for her, and I have nowhere else to go, sir. He'll... You don't need to run. He's the one who needs to be stopped." She shook her head in desperation. "I already tried once. Almost went to the police station, but I chickened out. I got scared." Eduardo took a deep breath. "I'll go with you." Helena looked at him as if she'd heard the impossible. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that?" And then came the answer she never expected. Because no one did, when they should have. The next day, grey and rainy, Eduardo's black car pulled up in front of the specialized domestic violence precinct. Helena got out with short, hesitant steps, then went inside. The office was cold, bureaucratic, but the officer who took her statement was kind and patient. She listened, and when Helena began to speak, her voice wavered, each word heavy. But she didn't stop. She recounted the threats, the coercion, the stalking, the manipulation, the pain. At the end, hands trembling, she signed the report. Eduardo waited outside, seated on a bench, staring at the ground, but he stood the moment he saw her emerge. She approached slowly, silent, holding the paper in her hands. "And now?" she asked, still afraid. "Now he can't touch you, he can't come near you." Helena stared at the document. A protective order. For the first time in her life, she held a paper that said she was safe. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was the beginning. And at that beginning, she wasn't alone anymore. The following days passed slowly. At the Duarte estate, everything looked the same on the surface. The manicured gardens, the silent halls, the familiar schedule. But inside, something had changed. Helena still woke early, still folded sheets, still made coffee, still cleaned windows with care. But there was something different in her now. She no longer flinched at footsteps behind her. She no longer shook when she saw Eduardo's name light up on her phone. And for the first time, she struck up a conversation with Mrs. Lucia, just to ask about a cake recipe. Small things, subtle, but saying so much. Eduardo watched from a distance, his gaze neither judgmental nor prying, simply observing. He saw her pause for a moment on the veranda at dusk. He saw her give a barely there smile at the faint music playing in the kitchen. He saw above all how she started to exist as if she no longer needed to hide. One evening after dinner, Eduardo entered the library with an envelope in hand. He called Helena over quietly and handed it to her without fanfare. She opened it carefully. Inside was a letter of recommendation signed by him, along with an application for a night course in business administration. The course wouldn't interfere with her work in the house. Helena stood there, stunned. "I remember you said you wanted to do this," he said simply. She looked at the papers as though they were sacred. "I don't know if I can do it," she whispered. "You don't have to know now, you just have to try." Helena didn't cry, but her misty eyes said it all. That night she sat on the garden bench, clutching the papers. The sky was clear, strewn with stars. For the first time, she wasn't waiting for something bad to happen. She was just there. The next morning, as she organized the linen closet, she heard soft knocks at the door. It was Eduardo. "By the way," he said, "you don't need to wear the uniform anymore." Helena frowned. "But I'm staff, sir." "You're part of this house now, too." She didn't know what to say. She only managed to smile, astonished at how much weight those words carried. Maybe because, for the first time, someone treated her like she belonged, rather than like someone temporary. "Can I still do the cleaning?" she asked, shyly amused. "Of course. Just promise me you'll clean your life too, in your own way. At your own pace, but do it." Helena nodded, and in that nod was something new. She was rebuilding herself, and this time, she wasn't doing it alone. The Duarte estate felt more alive. Maybe it was the quiet laugh Helena shared with Mrs. Lucia, or the way Eduardo, in recent days, showed up outside his office more often, sometimes with a cup of coffee, sometimes with nothing but his presence. Everything was moving forward, slowly but surely, until that afternoon. Helena was in the backyard, tending a small herb garden she'd started growing. It was her favorite spot now, the only place she could feel the breeze on her face without the past creeping back in. But what the wind brought that day wasn't lightness. Her phone buzzed inside, forgotten on the laundry room counter. When Eduardo passed down the hallway, he saw the screen flashing, a number restricted but all too familiar. He hesitated for a moment, then he answered. Silence on the other end. "Hello?" Eduardo said. A laugh, dry, cutting. "Who is this?" a male voice asked, already suspicious. "The man standing next to the woman you destroyed," Eduardo replied firmly. Silence followed. "Oh, so you're the one she's sleeping with now, huh?" Raphael sneered. Good at that, pretending to be her knight in shining armor. Watch your mouth, Eduardo cut in, ice in his voice. You don't know me, but I know you, Rafael Silveira. Repeat offender, threat history. I've forwarded your record to the authorities. If you try to contact her again, you won't be dealing with just lawyers. The line went dead. For a second, Eduardo only heard heavy breathing. She won't report you. She's afraid of me. She was afraid. Now she has support. And you scare no one anymore. And with that, he hung up. He stood there staring at his phone, blood pounding in his temples. It wasn't just anger, it was a line being drawn. That's when Helena appeared in the laundry room doorway. She saw the phone in his hand and froze. You answered? Eduardo simply looked at her, serious and gentle at the same time. He called, and I heard enough. Her face went pale, her hands trembled. He's going to be angrier now. Let him be. Coward's rage doesn't scare me. She tried to breathe, but the air wouldn't come. If he comes, and I disappear again, no one will look for me. And for the first time, Eduardo answered without hesitation. Now they will. The next morning, he beefed up the estate's security. Marcelo started sleeping on site. The external cameras were rechecked. Everything was made safer. But most important was what changed inside Helena. She didn't sleep well that night. But she didn't run, didn't slip back into her old habit of vanishing at the hint of pain. For the first time, she stayed. That morning's sky was clear, a soft blue, as if the world had briefly forgotten to be cruel. Helena walked barefoot through Duarte's garden. The grass was still damp from the day's first watering, but she didn't mind. She'd rediscovered the joy of feeling it beneath her feet. Mrs. Lucia watched from afar, as if witnessing a silent miracle. The girl who arrived wanting to disappear now filled the space with light. She no longer looked down when spoken to, no longer carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. Eduardo saw it too. More than saw. It felt it. The house, which for years had been nothing more than a functional space, now had a new rhythm, a kind of life you can't buy with contracts, something living, growing slowly, like that woman who, bit by bit, relearned how to exist. That afternoon, Eduardo came home early from work. He carried a simple package wrapped in brown craft paper. He found Helena sitting on the back porch, studying notes for the technical course she'd started weeks before. He approached calmly. "I brought you something." She looked up, curious, and opened the package slowly. Inside was a book, light blue cover, white letters on the front. The Power of Starting Over. She smiled, a small smile, but full. "I thought it might inspire you," he said, sitting beside her. "I'm already inspired just being here. Waking up every day without fear," she replied, her eyes misty. Silence. But not that tense early silence. This was gentle, shared, from two people who no longer needed to run. "Sometimes I wonder, what if you'd ignored that bruise? What if you'd pretended it wasn't your business?" she said in a near whisper. Eduardo paused, then answered, "Most people look away so they won't have to get involved. But sometimes, changing someone's life starts with a look that doesn't turn away." She nodded. In that gesture, there was gratitude, and something more, dignity. She wasn't a saved woman. She was a rebuilt woman. Later, Eduardo called her into his study. "I was thinking, you're not just an employee anymore. At least not only that. You're part of this house, of this story. You can choose what you want to be from here on out." Helena smiled, surprised. "Can I still do the cleaning?" she joked. "Of course, but promise me you'll keep cleaning your own life too, bit by bit, in your own way." "I promise." Months passed. The routine continued. Helena split her days between work, her course, and caring for her mother, who, thanks to continuous support, was getting better too. But the most beautiful thing wasn't what happened outside. It was what you saw in her eyes: security, clarity, presence. In the final scene, Helena sits on the porch, the same blue book in her hands. Eduardo approaches but says nothing. She looks at him and states softly but firmly, "I'm not afraid anymore." He smiles and replies, "And I have no more doubts." If you've ever been, or known, someone like Helena, drop one word in the comments: seen. That shows someone's pain didn't go unnoticed. And if this story deserves more hearts, leave a like and subscribe. We'll keep here, telling what no one sees.